We will. Miss Lyrian went to get a cup. We'll let her get her cup and get back. As soon as she gets back, we'll have give you the meeting. Okay.
Pardon?
Yes.
Yes.
I suppose. Take it away.
All right. Well, we did a presentation on general obligation bond, kind of rating overview during lead staff, and just in discussions with the group there, they thought it'd be a great pre-council meeting. So today the goal is to give you kind of a broad overview of the bond rating structure for general obligation bonds for the city, and what it means and how we basically achieve our AAA rating. So first of all, what is a bond rating? A bond rating is basically a statement of creditworthiness. They're judging your ability as an organization to repay the loans that are being taken out, and they're communicating that information to investors of the city. So basically it's a measure of risk on behalf of the organization on our ability to repay. So why a bond rating? So we have a bond rating because we do have investors, and those investors, this bond rating informs our investors basically of our ability to repay those bonds. You know, those investors typically are institutional type investors, so they're going to be mutual funds or ETFs. Sometimes banks buy them up, and also we have individual investors. So any citizen of the City of Lincoln can go out and buy our bonds. They sell them in $5,000 increments, and those are also tax-free earnings. So that's one major benefit of a municipal bond. So who rates the bonds? Typically, there's three primary rating agencies. We've got Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's. So today I want to focus on Standard & Poor's methodology and how they look at general obligation bonds, because each of them have kind of their own uniqueness to their rating, but I'll just be talking specifically about S&P today. So rating structure, so you have anywhere from AAA, which is where our bonds are rated for general obligation, down to D. You can see, you know, AAA is best, then you move down to AA, and then upper medium quality of A. Once you get below BBB, it's basically non-investment, or you could call those junk bonds. Typically, I think about only 3% of municipalities in the United States have a AAA rating. If you think about that as a AAA.
Say that number again, yeah.
Only 3%.
Yeah. So if you think about that, we've got a better credit rating than the United States government at this time, since the United States government has a AA rating.
Is Chicago, did they get rated junk? Did they get bumped down to junk now?
I haven't heard that officially yet, but I think we're kind of teetering on the edge there.
Brandon, we often hear people or entities, municipalities are rated at junk. So junk could be anything with BB and below, or do they give it a value, like a D junk or something?
Anything BB and below is considered a junk bond.
But do they still give a municipality, for example, a letter rating, even though they say it's junk?
Yeah, that's correct. They give you a rating, and basically that's an indicator to investors that it's a highly speculative rating.
How many cities are junk?
I can't tell you that off the top of my head. I think it would be fairly minimal.
But we're not.
Yeah, we're not. We're far from that.
I would suspect it might be higher than you think for states and municipalities due to pension obligations, because there are a lot of them that are treading very tenuously.
And that's one thing I'll talk a little bit about with pension obligations within this framework. So if you look at, right, today we're going to talk about general obligation bonds. We have other bonds too that range from AAA to AA for utilities, and then I think the lowest that we have is an A with the parking utilities. So for that upper medium quality. So this is the S&P rating framework. They've got 5 categories that they look at. I'd say that they're weighted based on what they feel the importance of those qualities are. I'd say that we have direct influence over 60% of those, and that would be debt and contingent liabilities, financial measures, and management. And then institutional framework and economy make up the other 40%. These are more global indicators that I'd say generally would be harder as a management of the city to impact. Within each of these frameworks, and as I go through each of these indicators, I'll be talking about, they rate them from kind of a 1 to 5. So it starts out at very strong, then strong, adequate, weak, and very weak. So within each of those indicators, you'll see one of those listed. So institutional framework, within this context, we're viewed as strong. So this is a rating, or this is part of the rating that's applied to all cities of the state of Nebraska. So regardless of each individual city, they rate them all the same in this area, so strong. They look at that as it's basically the operating environment that a city operates in within the state. They look at the confines of the state statutes, the state constitution, and how each of those allow a city to, can they raise their revenues without going to a referendum? So there's a lot of things within that context that they look at. I think things that they look at for the state of Nebraska is you have the ability to raise property taxes to a certain extent. There's a property tax lid, but they do recognize that most cities operate beneath that. There's not a lot of, I don't think there's a lot of referendum rights where, voter type situation to limit property tax revenue. They would look at that as a negative in this situation because it could impact the city's ability to repay bonds over time. Other things they look at, if there's significant changes at the state level in laws, is if there's changes in distribution patterns at the state level that could impact cities. And they look at all this within that framework. And I would say that this is one of the 10% of the total rating that is harder to change from a management perspective. Yes, you do have the ability to impact and change state laws. However, thinking about the constitutional changes, things like that, a little bit harder to impact. Economy is one of the largest areas that they look at. So that makes up 30% of your rating. We received the second highest rating at strong for this indicator. As I mentioned, I'd say this is one of the harder ones to impact because it's a global look at your city. This chart here shows the median income as a percent of the United States median income. You can see we hover around 100%. They look at that as a good thing for the city of Lincoln. Other things too, we continue to have growth in assessed valuation, which is something that they view as highly important for a city to continue the repayment of bonds over time. Other things that S&P views as strong about the city is that we have a very low unemployment rate. They see the state capital as a stabilizing factor for the city. We have a diverse economy, a growing population, and also having the state university that's a flagship campus here in the city is a definite positive. So things that could alter that would be if high unemployment, so if unemployment drove up high, if we saw continual population decreases, that could negatively impact this rating. or if we saw employment concentrations greater than 30%. So what they mean by that is, like, if you look at the city of Wichita, it's a highly concentrated industry for aircraft. So in a city like that has that high concentration, you know, that'd be really hard for them to achieve that AAA status because of that concentration, the cyclical nature of the economy. So management practices were rated strong. So this is one of the areas that we have the greatest ability to impact. So that makes up 20% of the rating. A lot of this comes down to managerial decisions and policies and practices that are in place. So, you know, more than anything, they want to see a balanced budget. They want to see policies in place at a global level, such as a debt policy, a reserve policy. You know, and they also look at your CAFR, your annual audited financial statements, and I'd say that's one area that we're highly successful in. If you looked at the CAFR this year, we had 0 findings, which in a city this large, I think is a great achievement. And also we report to the highest standards. So we've received the Government Finance Officers CAFR award for 26 years now, and I believe the longest running in the state. So that's something that we definitely like to talk about. Things that could influence.
What does CAFR stand for? CAFR? I know it's
things like the Certified Annual Financial Report,
okay.
or Certificate of Excellence. And I'd have to look it up specifically, but it's.
We get those each year.
Yeah.
Financial report. Okay, that's a good thing.
So other things that could possibly influence this is, as I mentioned, policies. So one thing that's mentioned specifically by the rating agencies is that the city doesn't have a debt policy in place right now. So that's one thing that we've been researching and looking at. And also, in kind of coordination with that, been reviewing the reserve policy for the city. And the reserve policy hasn't been updated in quite a while, so it's something that's good to review over a period of time, and it's coming up for review. In addition to that,
what is the benchmark that most municipalities strive to reach on financial reserves?
It depends, I guess, on what you're looking on, which rating entity that you're looking at. So
General liability.
S&P would say a 15% minimum. I think the policy currently in place for the general fund is 20%. I believe Moody's is higher than that, and I can't remember it's either 25 to 30% minimum for them for a AAA rating.
What's a debt policy? What do you mean by that?
Yes.
Okay, so a debt policy would say, as an organization, you know, generally these are the terms that we're gonna operate within. So we're gonna typically issue debt for general obligation debt for 20 years, or utilities for 30 years. And within that, we're gonna say, hey, we want to be a AAA rated organization for perpetuity. So within that policy, you would set certain indicators for debt levels, maybe debt per capita, things like that. And those would all be kind of stated within that policy.
Are there ways to do different kinds of debt that might allow you to avenues, whether it's a general obligation versus a revenue or other types of bonds that might allow you to get around that, still keep your rating?
You know, when a rating agency looks at this, they look at it from kind of the whole context. So, you know, when they're looking at a rating for general obligation, they're looking at kind of an entity citywide. So they're not only looking at just the general obligation, they're also looking at your other debt that could possibly impact the ability to repay. So they're looking at capital leases or tax-supported type debt.
So we get the same, or S&P in this case would give the same rating regardless of what type of bonds a municipality or Lincoln would be issuing, or would they have maybe a rating for a revenue bond because of its backing versus a general obligation? Could there be different ratings?
Yes, so there's definitely different ratings and different structures that they look at. So what I'm giving to you today would not apply to the utilities. That would be kind of a completely different structure of how they look at utilities.
We're just talking about general obligations.
We're just talking about general obligation bonds. Yeah. Utilities would take a whole nother presentation functionally. So the next area I want to talk about is financial. These are primarily financial measures, and there's 3 areas that they look at. Currently, we're rated very strong in this area, as the financial measures as a whole. So they look at budgetary performance, budgetary flexibility, and liquidity. So the first one I'll go to is budgetary performance. So we're currently rated as a strong. So when they look at budgetary performance, this graph shows you the general fund year-end surplus as a % of expenditures. So they want to see on an annual basis that you're able to balance the general fund consistently and maintain a surplus. So based on our past performance, they've looked at us as a strong in this area. And also having the charter only allowing appropriation at 90%, that helps in this area to maintain that surplus on an annual basis. The next area is budgetary flexibility. They rate us very strong. This is 10% of the total indicator. So this is available fund balance for the divided by the operating expenditures for the general fund. So you can see this looks at the way that rating agencies look at it is not only what you would call unassigned, which would basically be nothing that the city is restricted in any ways or means or don't have set aside for some other type of expense. So if you look at our unassigned, we're somewhere around 31%. But they also look at assigned to bring together that total available fund balance, because if needed, those could be utilized to, for instance, to repay bonds. So in that assigned category, you have certain things such as the fast forward fund, or those are rolled up into the general fund from a reporting standpoint. So when they look at the overall available fund balance, that's, I believe, somewhere around 45% for the city, for the general fund. So one thing that I want to talk a little bit about, and that's one reason they have very strong, is because that's a fairly good, significant balance for the general fund. So one thing that could impact that moving forward is the restricted tax lid, which could start to reduce the budgetary flexibility. So this graph shows basically our roll forward on the blue line with a 2.5% growth, which under state statute with the tax lid, you're capped at 2.5% for certain types of funds. So that could be motor vehicle, state aid, property tax revenues, sales tax revenues. And you're allowed to carry forward a certain amount per year. So this kind of shows, and I'm sorry, let me back up a little. One thing in addition, there's 3 ways to increase this amount. One is the council can vote to increase that by 1% per year as you adopt, and that's been included in the budget resolution in the past. That's what the kind of orange line shows on the graph, is if the council voted for that 1%. Now, in order to get that, there has to be 6 out of 7 votes on the council to have that additional 1%.
But Brendan, that means that we just have, that doesn't necessarily increase our expenditures or how we're not obligated to spend up to that additional 1%. That just gives us greater flexibility.
Gives you greater flexibility.
And that's what the bond agencies look at in terms of, in addition to our property tax lid, correct? And the flexibility or like spread that we might have to increase.
That's true.
About what percentage of, this one category on financial measures and on budget flexibility is that component weighted? I know in the county we had to deal with that too. Everybody had, it used to be just like we always would do it, slam dunk, and I think the last year that I was there, people were a little bit reluctant, but they always did it anyway, because it's not an indicator that we're gonna spend that extra 1%.
So, I mean, specifically what I'm talking about right here is a percent of the overall rating would be 10%.
Okay.
But when you look at it more from a global context as to the impact that this could have moving forward during the budget process is, you know, let's say on average our personnel costs grow 4%, and that's the biggest cost of the city. Well, as you see that blue line decreasing there, and right now, you know, we're estimating that to be a little above 4 million. As those rollover funds continue to deplete, we're going to be capped out from those restricted revenues at a 2.5% growth. So I guess the point of telling you this is at some point in the near future, without that additional 1%, we could be put in a budgetary situation where we're having to cut back on operating expenditures because of this restricted tax lid. So the next indicator is liquidity. So this looks at total governmental cash. So when you're talking about governmental cash, you're not only looking at the general fund, you're talking about, you know, the street construction fund, the West Haymarket JPA is rolled into this. So you look at liquidity, we're rated very strong. You know, we're somewhere, I believe, around 110% currently as a percent of governmental expenditures. Any questions on that?
So if you include the West Haymarket, does that also include the expenses of the West Haymarket, or you just?
Yes.
So you're not just taking credit for the cash it has?
Yeah, total governmental expenditures from, you know, West Haymarket, the street construction fund, I think some federal grants are lumped into this. So it's looking at all of those expenditures rolled up and then looking at the cash that we have available at year end.
Would that take tax income financing, TIF projects into account?
I don't think it would, but I'd have to look at that. I think it'd probably fall under maybe a special revenue category, which would be excluded from this, but I can look at that.
Now, with the 30-year debt that the West Haymarket has on the arena and so forth, is that also taken into account on those other categories you discussed a little bit ago?
That's correct.
And you have all that debt.
Yeah, and I got a slide coming up next on debt and contingent liability that we'll talk a little bit about that. Any other question? Okay. All right, so the next is debt and contingent liability. So within this, not only do they look at debt, but they also look at other post-employment benefits. So that's where your pension obligations, healthcare obligations will all come into play. So this, let me back up. So for a debt and contingent liability, this is 10% of the total. Currently, we're rated a weak within this area. And if you look at the indicators that they typically look at, so this is a percent of debt service to governmental expenditures, which would include the arena debt. The kind of gray line there is at 15%. So that's what anything between 8 and 15 S&P would consider strong. So you can see we're hovering right around 12%. The main increase back in 09-10 was because of the arena debt, so that's why you kind of see that spike there. So we look pretty good from that indicator. If you look at it from a debt as a percent of the total city valuation, so last year we were somewhere about 18.9 billion. You can see the total debt outstanding was below that 3% indicator, which would put us in a very strong type of category there. So from a debt capacity standpoint, that's not the issue we face. So the issue we face is more of the structure of the debt overall. So one thing that they'll look at included is how much of your debt is going to retire over the next 10 years. So if you look at this graph for 2017, we're just just below 30% that our debt is going to retire in the next 10 years. So when you think about the structure of the arena debt, that principal payments don't start till 2020, that principal is going to take quite a while to retire off the books. So S&P would give you a notch upgrade if you're somewhere up here between about 65%. So this graph here looks at current debt and also projected debt based off of the current CIP. And if we wanted to get back into that 65% tile, it'd take us till about 2030 to reach that.
So this chart is just showing the percent that's being retired
over a 10-year over the upcoming 10-year period.
Looks like it's 15 years.
Yeah, I just put that 15 on to show it in a graphical format.
Now, what happens though? We're constantly taking on new debt. So
and that's one thing.
You're assuming static and no new debt.
This includes new debt based upon what was included in the capital improvement program. So one thing that any rating agency is going to do, they're going to go out and they're going to look at your capital improvement program, and they're going to look at that debt and how it's going to impact your debt levels over the upcoming planning period.
How do things like the RTSD factor in here, or the Public Building Commission that has debt?
And those types of entities wouldn't factor into this since they're strictly looking at the city of Lincoln.
But those are interlocal, like pension or Public Building Commission is an interlocal between the city and the county. I know it has its own mill levy, but
sometimes they look at underlying factors, like let's say the DEC. They'll look at the city as an underlying factor. So let's say the Public Building Commission, when you're going through a rating process, when you're going through debt there, it'd be rated as an individual entity, but then they would probably look at both the city and the county as an underlying factor, since that's where some of the revenues come from.
I'm sorry.
That's okay, not a problem. So did you say this area were rated weak or very weak?
Weak.
Weak. And so what would be required in order for us to increase our rating?
Well, like I mentioned, it's not a debt capacity issue. It's the structure of the bonds. So it's just going to take a while, I think, to increase this type of rating because of the long-term nature of the arena bonds. So if you look at our debt for governmental debt right now, it's somewhere around $470 million at the end of 2017. Of that, 74% is arena debt. Those bonds don't make their first principal payment until 2020. So until we start paying on that principal down, it would be hard, I think, to impact this indicator.
So if we started paying down on it early, though, we could see it move quicker into the stronger area.
It depends on the structure of the bonds, and it probably depends more on when those bonds could be callable, and at that time if you could pay down a certain amount of those bonds.
Sure. And then does this rating that we have right now, does this include, as we're going forward, does this include, you said the CIP, so does it include stuff like the library bond that was proposed in the CIP?
That's correct.
Okay.
do you have a breakdown, or will you be showing us a breakdown of that $470 million of city debt you just referred to?
I don't have it right here specifically.
That's critical, because that would show the arena, like you mentioned, said 72%, but then you've also got the defined benefit plan for police and firefighters, which is, depending how you do it, 50 to 100 million. DEC debt, District of Energy, you've got, depending what you do on Public Building Commission, plus our COPS bonds. I mean, we've been issuing a lot. How about LES debt?
LES would not be included in this since they're a utility. They've kind of got their own structure that they'd be rated under.
But they're wholly owned city.
They are part of the city, but this is looking at the general obligation bond repayment. So, when they're talking about that type of debt, the things that could impact that, your ability, because they're basically repaid with property tax revenue. So they're looking strictly at that portion.
So you're saying then the 470 is just million is general obligation debt, so that wouldn't include our revenue bonds and other.
That's correct. It wouldn't
So how much
include.
debt does the city have presently?
I don't have that with me right now, but I can get that
Can
to
you
you.
estimate? Is it $1 trillion or not $1 trillion, $1 billion?
A billion. Gotta be
Gotta
close
be
to
over
that.
$1 billion.
I'd have to send that to you.
Can't estimate. You're a finance director.
I can pull it up real quick if you'd like.
Let's proceed with your presentation
Maybe
for
at the
now.
end you can pull it up then.
Okay. So, yeah, like I mentioned, the OPEB cost, that's something that they look at within this area too. One area I think that we could, if we hit that 80% mark, which we're really close to, for funding ratio, then we could potentially get a bump up there from basically an extra point for hitting that mark. With that, that's the presentation. I can pull up some information if you'd like.
Yes.
Real quick? Okay, all right.
Are these things we can go on the city website or constituents could go on to and get the same information? Or
Yes,
do you
that's
have a-
correct. So we post all our annual financial statements out there. So if you go to departments, then accounting, the comprehensive annual financial report, which is our CAFR, you can look at 2016. And then under the notes to the financial statement is where there's a discussion in here about outstanding debt. So on this page, you'll see, and this is on page 54, you'll see general obligation bonds, tax allocation, tax supported. So this will list all of our debt, and this is for the year of 2016 year end. So you can see total kind of general obligation debt of 443 million there. Then you move to your business type activities. So your business type activities are going to include your water, wastewater, electric utility. So those total revenue bonds were outstanding 755 million as of year end 2016.
So that gets us over $1 billion.
Yeah.
Now, is the pension debt in there?
Pension is considered, it's not a debt per se, but it would be considered other post-employment benefit. So it wouldn't be considered in this section, but if you, within the notes, that's described. So you can see kind of the net pension liability on page 62 of the CAFR.
What page?
62.
I don't know, how much is that listed as currently?
57.
57.7 million.
You mentioned you've gone, if I may, on S&P, and as you said, there's Fitch and the Moody's, thank you, ratings. I guess a couple of questions. One, do we have to pay, they have to make money somehow to do all this research, which is fairly comprehensive, to put their name on the rating out there. So do we pay annual fees to each of these to get a rating, or how does that work?
So anytime you issue bonds, you go through that rating process, and at the time that we issue bonds, that's when you would pay a rating agency.
So it's included in the bond.
It's included, yeah. It's part of the issuance cost of the bond.
So when we say Lincoln has a AAA rating or something, is that just based upon the latest bond issuance when they last rated us?
That's correct.
So it isn't really, I mean, if we didn't have a bond for several years, we keep saying AAA, but maybe really other things have deteriorated or improved, it could be
But
different.
even though you go through that rating process every time you issue a bond, they typically do an annual review as well. So they're coming back and confirming that rating. So they can continue to tell our investors basically how we're doing.
So do they do that without a fee to us to do that annual rating?
On the confirmation, that's correct.
And so do we also get rating, is it generally just S&P, or do we go to Fitch and Moody's for bonds? I just don't remember off the top of my head.
So for general obligation bonds, we have Moody's and Standard & Poor's. I believe on the utilities, we also have that, except for the electric utility, which I believe uses Fitch and Moody's.
Okay.
Carl? Brandon, so what's the consequence of not having a good bond rating? What does it mean to a city when that happens?
So every time you issue a bond, you get the rating, and then when you go to market, that rating is an indicator of how good of bids you receive. So the higher the rating that you receive, the lower the interest rates that you're going to pay.
Okay.
Because the risk is lower to the purchaser.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
You mentioned early on the debt policy, and you implied we didn't have one, or that having one would improve our rating.
So yeah, I mentioned that. That's specifically, I think, noted in the last Moody's rating, is that we don't have a debt policy in place. So when I talked about that from a management standpoint, that's one area that you could improve. That, you know, if we had a debt policy in place, they could look at that as a better management practice by having that.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we're adjourned until 2 o'clock.